Okay, this week we look at the economics of industries and business. So last week you looked at how people go to work, and this week we're going to look at the people that employ those people who go to work, which are the industries and the companies. We're going to do this by taking a look at monopolies and oligopolies and talking about how the government helps to restrict monopolies so that you can have the most options available to you as a consumer. We're also going to look at how property rights help to create business and shape the way that we live today in the United States. So the word of the week is a barrier to entry. The idea of a barrier to entry is that if you have a really large company like Coca-Cola and somebody wanted to compete with Coca-Cola to create a new beverage company that sold soft drinks and energy drinks and bottled water and boxes of the syrup so you could have all the drinks at all the baseball games and fast food places, right? If you wanted to compete with them, you would have all kinds of barriers in your way. Just like this, in the picture here, you see somebody has created a little rest stop on the side of the mountain to sell drinks and food and climbing supplies. There's enormous barriers to entry in order to create that business on the side of the mountain. You'd have to do all kinds of things to get that set up, right? It's literally there are barriers, like the side of a mountain. In real life, it's the idea that you would have to compete with a very large company that already has all the resources in place and probably controls all the suppliers and already has all the equipment and needs very little to sustain itself that it doesn't already have. But you have none of that, so there's huge barriers in place. There are in the United States histories of several cases where the U.S. government split up large companies into smaller ones in order to protect the consumer, because the smaller companies have to compete with each other, which means that prices stay low and there's competition so that the best product is available to you and not just a single version of one product. Historically, when John D. Rockefeller, you might have heard of that name, or the Kennedys, like John F. Kennedy, Bobby Kennedy, that's a similar family, right? This family in 1870 controlled the oil manufacturing and distribution in the United States. It was known as Standard Oil. And the U.S. government, through an antitrust case, split up Standard Oil into several smaller oil refineries and gas stations. This happened a few different times, and today, after all these steps you see on your screen there, we end up with Chevron, ExxonMobil, BP, and Marathon. Probably you've heard of all those. Along the way, there was several splits and mergers for us to end up with those four companies. And this is how we live today, where there's gas stations that compete on price instead of having one option of gas station called Standard Oil that could charge whatever they wanted for gas. My grandfather ran a Sinclair station that was related to Standard Oil, and he was able to get a number of franchises that looked a lot like the ones in the picture here. And he would maintain the cars that came through that needed, new oil changes and new windshield wipers and belts and fans and hoses and gasoline. They did all these kinds of things, but he was around after the time that this split took place, and so he had to compete with all these other stations. If he just worked for Standard, it would have just been that they take the price of whatever Standard sets, and it would have probably been instead of all the different brands of things behind him on the shelf, there probably would have just been one brand of each thing and would have said Standard on it. So whether or not it was the best or not wouldn't have mattered. The U.S. government helps us avoid that situation by splitting up large companies. Another idea of a barrier to entry is we can see that the U.S. government spends more on United States military defense than several of its competitors combined. So if you took all the military spending of China, Russia, Saudi Arabia, India, France, the UK, and Japan, they spent less in 2017 than the US did combined. So this is an idea of barrier to entry. If you wanted to have a military that could stand up to the US, you would have to have a much larger investment starting off, right, just to get set up. And then you would have to constantly be putting in billions and billions and trillions of dollars to keep up. So there's a big barrier to competing with the US military. So again, monopolies, oligopolies. Historically, oil, like the example I gave you, was the monopoly, along with the steel industry and the railroads. A pure monopoly is one which is controlled by one seller of a good or service, and it has no close substitute. So there's nobody else, no other company that is providing that good or service, and the monopoly can do whatever it wants. It's a lot like in the board game Monopoly, where you're trying to buy up all the property and control the whole market and put everyone else out of business. An oligopoly is similar to that, but instead of just one company, you have a few, and each company has a very large share of the industry as a whole. A good example of this would be the credit card companies, where you have Visa, MasterCard, American Express, and maybe 2 or 3 more. There's a handful, but if you wanted to compete with those, it'd be very difficult. Same is true, as I said, with Coca-Cola. You have Coca-Cola, Pepsi, and maybe a couple other bottling plants that compete, but not really to the degree that Pepsi or Coke do. You would have airlines, Spirit Airlines, Frontier Airlines, Delta, United, American. These are large companies that offer similar products and services, but there are only a few because it would be so expensive to start a new airline, like Verizon did, right? You create a whole new airline, Virgin, not Verizon. Virgin Atlantic created a whole new airline, and it was an enormous investment. That's what makes an oligopoly. Monopoly is one, oligopoly is a few. Historically in the US, we've had this antitrust law. A trust would be like a monopoly. So antitrust means against monopolies. And the US government is trying to avoid situations where companies are able to fix prices, allocate territories, or exclusively deal with only one group of people. So it would be like discriminating, right? Or to say that a price which is unfair is the only price and you have to pay it. Anything that's unfair competition or deceptive or is against competition, things that would be like all companies merging together and not competing anymore, the kinds of laws that address this are known as the Sherman Act, the FTC Act, and the Clayton Act. That's what antitrust law is represented by. The most famous was the Sherman Antitrust Act of 1890. It was only 2 pages and about 9 paragraphs, and in that they decided that there needed to be competition and that it had to be fair. This is what it looked like. This is what shapes the way we live today, just about as much as the Bill of Rights, the Declaration of Independence, or the Constitution, because all the things we do revolve around there being companies that are supplying the products and services that allow us to live the way we do. And it's because of this document that all that is possible, the way we know it today. This document says that interactions between states and nations are not to be restrained from trade. It's illegal to restrain trade. So this would be like if somebody said that Georgia was not allowed to trade with Alabama. In that case, there would be issues because, everything is better off with us being able to trade with Alabama. It's not that they're separate nations. It's not that they're separate entities and trading zones. You're not allowed to say we control all the routes in Georgia and they control all the routes in Alabama. That sounds a lot like drug trades. Alright, you're not allowed to conspire to trade, which means to be sneaky and make secret deals in order to create a monopoly. That's not allowed. Territories apply to areas like Puerto Rico. So both they're looking at trade in states, in outside territories, and internationally. The court system is the guardian. So if somebody does you wrong and you're a company, you can take them to court and use the district attorneys all the way up to the Supreme Court to make sure that your case is heard and that violators are tried and have to pay penalties. If you're summoned, you have to go to court. And any property that is found to be ill-gotten gains has to be forfeited to the U.S. and can be seized and condemned. A person who's injured can sue a company. That's the idea that like a corporation represents a person. So if a corporation does something wrong to you, poisons your property's water well or something like that, you can sue the company themselves. And this says you're allowed to recover 3 times the damages that were sustained. So if they cost you $100,000, you can sue them for $300,000 plus the costs of attorneys and legal fees. The last bit is that companies can sue each other. Alright, so all of that, which you may have seen things like that on TV and movies and television and the news, that comes from the Sherman Antitrust Act, which was just 2 pages. Right? That gives us the way we live today. So we have an assignment on Connect that's looking at monopolies and oligopolies for antitrust. Your task here before Sunday at midnight is to explain what antitrust litigation is. That's pretty much what I just went over and what the historical context is in the U.S. Then find an example of a U.S. government body, that's going to be like the federal government, trying to impact the operation of an industry with antitrust litigation. So that's a past historic example. In the same industry that the U.S. government was trying to impact, explain how the industry was controlled either by a monopoly or an oligopoly. Fourth, you're going to look at the companies that are around today and see in that same industry which companies survive today. And the market cap is the number of shares that are in the stock market times the current traded stock price. So if you look up market cap of Apple, it will come up as, so many $1 trillion. And if you looked up market cap of Microsoft, it would give you the value of that company. So you're looking for the market cap, which is the valuation of that company in dollars based on the stock value. That's number 4. Finally, 5. Today, is it still the same companies that are in power as when the government intervened, or did somehow the government change the arrangement of the industry through their legal action? All right, so answer those questions and please submit it as a PDF or Word document and cite your sources. The next part is a forum on property rights. The idea of property rights is, again, that you can own something and invest in something and build a company and not worry about somebody else taking your company from you because it's your company. You have it. Anything that you buy, like a house, a car, a backpack, some shoes, you understand in your mind that it's yours and yours alone and no one can take it from you. So the government gives you that protection. That's the idea. You could call the police and say somebody stole your car and they will go looking for your car. What we're going to look for here in your forum post is to find an example where property rights were disputed between the U.S. government and a company, and try to find a historic case of this, an example, and explain how the case was resolved. So what company was involved, what U.S. organization was involved, what was the property? Was it a house, a field, a county, a military base? What was it? Which court heard the case? Was it a local court, the Supreme Court? And then what was the outcome? What was decided? What does it mean what is the decision? So you're saying what the decision was, and then explain what does that mean for the way we live today. So what is that decision's impact today? That's the main idea for your forum post. So it says the main area of thought is after you've looked through this example, I want you to think about what it means for the way we live today. How has the decision which was made in the past influenced the way that commerce and consumer behavior are observed in the present? What does it mean for the way that businesses work today and how you live as a consumer? So that's all for today. For this week, please get that in by Sunday 11 p.m. or midnight at the latest, and comment on each other's posts for extra credit point. I hope you're having a good week and a good time in the class. Please let me know if you have any questions, and thank you for keeping up all the good work. Bye.